Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank Microsoft for their generosity in letting us in hosting us here. I think it's one of the downsides of the digital economy is when you reserve your own conference room using the internal internet reservation system and it doesn't work, then you end up having to scramble at the last minute. So, by the way, there's lots of seats up here for folks in the back. Just come on in and grab one. I think for those of you who were here and you saw the upcoming events part of ITIF, for some strange reason we have a proliferation of events coming up over the next 5 weeks just because a lot of different issues, one on net neutrality and network management tomorrow. There's going to be one on a really interesting event on the whole controversy over encryption. But anyway, I encourage you to look at our events page or follow the weekly email if you don't get it for those future events. So let me start by introducing our panelists today, who I will give a short presentation of the findings and recommendations in our report, and then we'll have a dialogue with our panelists. I'll start with Joe Alhadeff, who's the Vice President of Public Policy and Chief Privacy Strategist at Oracle. Joe, for those of you who don't know him, he's ubiquitous. I think he probably spends more time overseas than he does in the U.S. He serves as the BIAC chair at the OECD Information Communications Committee. He's the vice chair of the Chamber of Commerce's International Digital Economy Committee. He has similar roles with the India Business Council, the Malaysia Committee, the State Department, U.S. ASEAN, et cetera, et cetera. So a deep, deep expert on these global IT and information policy questions. Andrea Glorioso is a counselor for digital economy at the European Union, the U.S. delegation just down the street. He plays a central role, liaison between U.S. and EU on policy issues around IT and the digital economy. Before that, he worked 8 years at the Commission in Brussels and has a background as a private sector software developer. Jonathan McHale is Deputy Assistant USTR for Telecom and has been in that role since 1997. And in that role is responsible essentially for all things telecom and IT at USTR, and has been the lead negotiator for many, many important agreements, including now the TPP, but prior to that, the EU and Japan implementation of the WTO Basic Telecom Agreement, APEC Mutual Recognitions Agreement, et cetera, et cetera. So a deep, deep expert on these international trade questions around ICT or IT. And finally, Jared Ragland is joining us as Director of Policy at the Business Software Alliance, or BSA. Before joining, in that role, he's responsible for helping develop international strategies around IT and software policy. Before joining BSA, Jared was at the PTO, and then before that was Director of Intellectual Property at USTR. Okay, so why are we doing this report? Well, actually, the reason we're doing this report is because Jonathan McHale said we should do it. It's actually somewhat of a misnomer, but recently had a conversation with Jonathan. He was explaining how many companies, as he goes around and talks to countries about the importance of cross-border data flows, what he has seen is that traditional industries, firms in traditional industries, I should say, are quite engaged in cross-border data activity, and oftentimes policymakers in those countries are not aware of that. So what you have had develop in this space is essentially a sort of idea that foreign policymakers hold, which is that it's only U.S. technology companies that are responsible or dependent upon cross-border data flows. It's only the Microsofts of the world, or the IBMs, or the Googles, or the Oracles. And since those are not our companies, those are their companies, we're sort of okay with putting restrictions on cross-border data flows, the logic goes. If we do that, perhaps we can get 7 jobs at a data center. Or perhaps we can sort of privilege our own internet firms. Or perhaps we can protect privacy. The problem with that view, as we'll show today, is that the largest users of cross-border data flows, the companies most reliant on that, are not the IBMs, Googles, Microsoft, and Oracles. They're the traditional industries and traditional firms. And so by enacting these policies that are essentially information protectionist policies, these countries are simply hurting their own industries. Okay. Yeah. Why did you do that? All right, any ideas on that one?
When you bump the cable, it's occasionally this.
Oh, okay. I will not touch the cable. Okay. As they say in Ghostbusters, do not cross the streams. Okay. All right, so this is what I just said. Cross-border data flows enable commerce. But if you look at some of these traditional industries, Rio Tinto is a global mining company based in Australia. And you wouldn't think of mining as a data-intensive operation, but increasingly it is. And they receive and send 30 gigabytes a day from all of their mines all around the world. And they have to analyze that, including analyzing it for safety, including analyzing it for yields, and including analyzing that, frankly, to reduce their environmental footprint as they're mining. In fact, what Rio Tinto has developed is essentially what they call the mine of the future. And the mine of the future is an IoT-enabled mine. It's using sensors, it's using other kinds of communications to make sure that they can do all of this in a sustainable way. And by the way, all of these companies are just examples of what the industry as a group is doing. So many mining companies around the world are doing these kinds of information practices. You have Unilever, which is a UK and Dutch company. They collect information and use business analytics from 190 different countries. They're a global multinational. And they use that data to help figure out what customers like, what kinds of things they should develop, how can they develop things that are better and cheaper. In fact, in 2011, Unilever started implementing plans to consolidate essentially 40 data warehouses around the country into one. It makes no sense for them in an era of global connectivity to have 40 separate data centers. They can just have one. Now, if you have policies that require localization of data centers, that makes that business model very, very hard, if not impossible, to conduct. Royal Dutch Shell, again, anybody want to guess where Royal Dutch Shell is from? Very good. All right. It's like anybody want to guess what year the War of 1812 was. Okay, so Royal Dutch Shell, again, a multinational company like Exxon, like BP. They have sensor data on the wells that they drill, and they use that data to figure out all sorts of things, like how do they get greater recovery, how do they have more efficient drilling, how do they have more safer drilling. But again, they don't just have data on that well and a little computer scientist sitting there in one of those little teeny apartments on the rig analyzing that data. They take that data, they send it, I'm assuming through satellite in this case, they send that data to a place where their data scientists are analyzing data on all of their wells all around the world. Tesco, British retailer with operations in many, many countries around the world. And what they do is they collect in-store data. They have increasingly they have electronic shelves which know something went off the shelf, something was sold, and they can use that data to make sure that they have adequate inventory, particularly when inventory is crossing borders, that they know that it's going to be there. Okay, Boeing. So I had a great experience on an airplane where they canceled my flight, but one of the reasons that they don't cancel flights as much is because these flights now are collecting and transmitting a large amount of data. So when a Boeing plane goes from New York to London, the engines are generating 300 terabytes of data. That's like a little thing. That's a lot of little thumb drives. Now, what's good about that is that if there's a problem with the engine, if they think, this engine is showing some wear, or it's running slightly hot, when they get to London, they can have the part there, they can have the maintenance people ready, they can get that engine repaired or fixed or upgraded or whatever it might be, and so that the plane is not going to be out of service for very long. So the key thing here is it reduces flight delays, improves safety, But what if we had a rule that said, oh, that data cannot be transferred across borders? Yeah, that would only help domestic flights. It wouldn't help international flights. Volvo, a Swedish company, actually technically a Chinese company now, but it was a Swedish company. And their trucking group collects I think Volvo Trucking is still Swedish, is that right? I think it is. I think Volvo Trucking is still Swedish. Volvo Autos was bought by the Chinese. Collects diagnostic data from 20 countries around the world and then uses it. And again, same thing as with airlines. It limits component failures, can find lost or stolen vehicles, remotely diagnose problems. So if you're a fleet owner and you have a lot of these trucks in your system, you want to know, hey, you know what? I better make sure that when that truck comes in, I better have that truck come in for maintenance. Otherwise, it's going to break down on the road and cost me a lot of money. And finally, two more, Alliance Medical and Hermes Medical. These are healthcare companies. They have MRI technologies, and they're able to use that technology to send the images basically anywhere for remote diagnostics. Okay, finally, ING Bank, which was my bank until it got bought by a U.S. company. So I'm technically still my bank. But a great internet banking company. By the way, interesting case here. ING Bank was the first banking company really in the world to roll out full-based internet banking with no branches. The interesting thing is they couldn't do that in the Netherlands because of barriers and limitations on e-commerce. So they rolled that out in the U.S. first. But they collect all sorts of transactional data in 48 million countries in 40 countries around the world. And they use that for things like fighting fraud. Now, I don't know how many people here think that fraud is limited to only one country and that the Russians would never engage in financial transaction fraud. But if you don't have that ability to cross all sorts of borders with that data, it's very, very difficult to be able to engage in that kind of analytics. So, bottom line, these data flows are all global. And I think as Joe Alhadeff will say, we just kind of pick the big chunk data. There's all sorts of little transaction data that you can see which flows across borders to improve consumer welfare, improve economic productivity. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to do something because, as we've pointed out in a number of reports in the past, what we call data mercantilism is growing significantly. Countries are looking out and they're saying, hey, we don't really think that we want to just be a country that's generating data. We want to make sure that those data centers are in our country. Even though data centers don't provide hardly any jobs when you think of it, countries still think, well, data centers are pretty cool, we better get them in our country. Or for privacy reasons, which as we've, I think, done a very good job of highlighting frankly, the false nature of the argument that keeping data in your country has anything to do with privacy or security. It simply doesn't. What matters is your domestic regime for governing privacy and security, not where those data are located. So in any case, countries are engaged in these new practices, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's China, whether it's Brazil. And so we need a global set of policies and agreements and actions to roll back essentially data mercantilism or localization barriers to trade around data. What should we do? Well, one step would be to have international organizations develop good measures. Right now, the USTR is probably the group that's developing the best measures on this, along with OECD. But this is something the WTO should take on as a measure, and every year produce some kind of data-based report about what countries are doing to limit cross-border data flows. We need a global metric that everybody agrees is a robust one, and then use that to push back on data mercantilists. Secondly, international organizations can do that. And thinking here in particular of international organizations like the World Bank. The World Bank has been pushing now for at least 15 years as a core part of its development strategy the idea that low-income countries like the Philippines and South Africa and other countries should develop data center and data entry capabilities to employ people in their countries and move up the development ladder. So at one level, a core part of the World Bank strategy is to encourage data flows, because if you don't have data flows, those data can't go to South Africa to be analyzed and processed. At the same time, the World Bank provides significant development funding to the very countries that are engaged in stopping or banning cross-border data flows. So at the one hand, they're promoting, World Bank promotes cross-border data flows, and on the other hand, they reward the recalcitrant countries who want to stop cross-border data flows. So it's a very easy answer. World Bank makes its aid contingent upon countries committing to open and cross-border data flows. If you're not willing to commit to that, you don't get World Bank support. Third, U.S. great trade agreements. And I'm sure Jonathan will talk about this, but certainly right now the TPP negotiations, at least as we're aware of them, have gone the farthest of any trade agreement the U.S. has ever negotiated in ensuring very robust and rock-solid protections to make sure that border data can travel across borders. We would hope that if there's a TTIP agreement, maybe Andrea can talk to that, that this would also include those kinds of agreements. That Europe EU is a little more complicated because you have things like the safe harbor, but I'm hopeful and confident we can do that. Fourth, we suggest that the U.S. should propose a special data services agreement in the WTO. This would be sort of like the ITA, the Information Technology Agreement of 1996, but essentially an agreement that countries would sign on to and that puts in place an enforceable, actionable regime that would limit or ban these kinds of data protectionist practices. And finally, U.S. Trade Promotion Authority should obviously work to do that. But finally, one of the problems I think that has come up with this, obviously, is Snowden has made this problem more problematic by divulging all of these information, or perhaps you can argue the other way, by engaging in some of these actions by the U.S. government. It's given the other countries, particularly countries that have always looked for an excuse to be data protectionist, it's given them this beautiful excuse. Look, we're not really being data protectionists. We're just doing that because we want to protect our citizens against the intruding eyes of the NSA. Now, there's several problems with that. Obviously, the NSA's intruding eyes don't really respect about borders. They want to get into that data in another country. They have a pretty good shot at it, just like here. Secondly, it's not like other countries don't do this too. The Germans' intelligence organizations, the British intelligence organizations, they all do it. In fact, one could make, I think, a good case that the NSA is, as an intelligence and data collecting organization, has pretty robust restrictions on what it can do compared to other countries. By the way, just to be clear, not that it's perfect and we need reform there. But in any case, I think the result of all of that suggests that we need some kind of what we would call Geneva Consensus on the Geneva Convention on the status of data. In other words, countries agree to this, and it basically it enables sort of robust MLAT agreements. It also clarifies the current, not to pick on this particular case, but the kind of case now that Microsoft is engaged in with the U.S. intelligence agencies wanting to get access on a non-U.S. person located where their data are located in Ireland. We need a global consensus on what the solution to that is. It can't just be the U.S. has one policy and other countries have other policies. All right, so with that, thank you for your attention on that. What I'm going to do is ask our four panelists and respondents to come on up, and we'll have a conversation from the seats. Yeah. All right, Joe, I'm going to put you on the spot first, and in part, I'm going to put you on the spot first, in part because you live this sort of 24/7. And you see how other countries around the world are thinking about this. So I guess first question is, did we frame this the right way? Are there other things we missed there? And then sort of any other sort of general framing thoughts before we maybe do another round where we delve in more specifically?
Yeah, I would say, as you highlighted, I would argue that looking at the big chunks of data is important, but at the end of the day, that understates the problem. If anyone travels to Europe and checks in a hotel, that's a data flow if you'd like to get your bonus points, if you'd like to have your preferences honored. So there are tons of day-to-day interactions that create the data flows. And our life has become such that when the computer goes down, it is impossible to function in a transaction. Your plane can't take off if they can't call to find out what the load factors are related to their takeoff and what the optimal fuel economy is for the way they fly. So data is now ubiquitous, and its flow is fairly ubiquitous. I think the other thing which is alluded to, but perhaps which we see as a growing problem as well, is technology mandates. Not only do you have to keep your data in a data center in our country, you have to use our algorithm, you have to use locally sourced technologies, and that also has economic impacts related to the data and impacts related to potential for innovation. The other thing I would say is, and I'm going to use the plane example for that, is if you look at the plane example and the engine that is sending the 320 terabytes of data back home, that's completely not personally identifiable information. That will incidentally touch personally identifiable information, because if there's a determination that the plane needs service, it's going to interact with an HR system that's going to pull a mechanic's name and associate that mechanic's name with a work order. And there are some countries and regulators that will then assume that the entire set of data is personally identifiable, when in fact there was one small element that had a personally identifiable aspect to it. So again, we have to differentiate between data that is raw data that may have commercial value but is not personally identifiable and should not be treated as such, versus the ecosystem effect that at some point it may be associated with personally identifiable information. We should also recall that the scope of what is personally identifiable information is being expanded. It used to be you had to go to an identifiable person, so I had to eventually go, this is Joe. Now you just have to go to the fact that this is the same individual. So you don't need to ever associate that individual with an identity. It's now going to the fact that you can associate that as a unique individual. And that threshold is much lower than getting to the person. So again, that's another issue that is cropping up. That's not ubiquitous, but it is true across much of Europe in judicial and other decision making, and it would be true in the definition of the new draft regulation absent changes to the scope. If I have a couple of minutes, I just want to make a couple of other observations. The other thing is, and it's not really alluded to in the paper because it's a little bit outside the scope, especially in the world of privacy, I think we've forgotten the tenets of how to do a correct risk analysis. Privacy has all of a sudden become risk elimination. We eliminate risk. We no longer mitigate risk. And when you think about normal risk management, what you do is you think about the benefit, you take a look at the risk, and then you associate that benefit and that risk, and you put in place the mitigation that is necessary to get to acceptable risk. But you can't define acceptable risk if you don't understand what the benefit is. And too often now the benefit is left out of the equation. So I think we also need to have a richer method of risk analysis, especially when it comes to privacy. When you looked at, I'll just do one last comment, and that is, there was APEC is another group that's been working on some of these issues. And one of the things APEC is working on is interoperability between systems. So currently they're looking at binding corporate rules in the European Union and cross-border privacy rules in APEC, and trying to figure out what is the way to make them work together. So at least while you're not going to get a harmonized solution, you can get something that is interoperable, which is an interesting way to go forward. But the other thing that APEC did, and this was done, I think it was drafted in 2009 and adopted by leaders in 2010, was something called the Digital Prosperity Checklist. And the Digital Prosperity Checklist was a concept of what are businesses looking for if they are going to come to your country. So exactly kind of the economic benefits Rob was talking about attracting business. And the concept was it was predicated on the 6 I's. And the 6 I's were infrastructure, innovation, investment, intellectual capital, information flows, and integration. Okay, the last I is cheating because integration actually stands for trade, but we couldn't come up with a better I for trade. So integration means at the border, behind the border, across the border. But the whole concept of that matrix was they all work together. So if you constrain information flows, you are not just constraining the ability of your economy to use information, you are constraining the ability of your economy to be innovative, to attract investment, to develop the appropriate infrastructure, to have the correct intellectual capital. These are matrixed and these are overlapping and interdependent. And you can't just say, I can deal with information flows and not impact the broader realm of the economy. And this goes way beyond ICT. This is a horizontal issue. We don't find a single company we talk to that doesn't think this is an important issue to deal with. So with that, turn it back.
Great. No, thank you. And before I go to Jared, I just want to, couple points. We engage in cross-border data flows because we have people from all around the world that come to our website and register, and by definition we have data on European persons and Malaysian persons and Saudi Arabian persons. You know, Joe, your point about risk, I can't resist responding. You know, there's this view that we should have zero risk, and this plays out in the argument around what's called de-identification of data sets. And we just wrote a big report on that last year. And so let's say I know, for example, I don't know how much money you have in your bank account and all your transactions. There's basically a 1 in 300 million chance that I'm going to be able to identify that as you, right? Because I have one data set. There's 300 million people in the U.S. and so the odds are it's 1 in 300 million. It's you. Now, what if I say, okay, this is the bank account information, and I know it's a male. Now I'm down to 150 million to 1. What if I know it's a male who lives in DC region, then I'm down to 7 million to 1. My point is that you can de-identify things, but it's really all about risk. So the question on data and on privacy is, you know, what's the risk reward? So probably what you want on anything along that is a sort of a 1 in 10,000 chance maybe. But the idea that you can never ever eliminate risk, or that you can always limit risk, I think is one that's hard.
I would perhaps phrase that as, when we look at the identification concepts, is it de-identified appropriately for the specific purpose for which it's being used? Because 1 in 10,000 may not be correct for some concepts, it may be correct for others. So it's more that it's risk dependent, it's context dependent. And it's very difficult to draft a law which is a top-down instrument to recognize and be applied to context.
Jared, you sort of certainly saw this when you were at USTR and engaged there, but also now are seeing it with your role at BSA. Do you want to share your thoughts on this and what you see going on?
Sure. Was this on? I mean, first of all, I think the report was very good and very timely. We at BSA, we're representing a lot of the companies that are sort of the traditional IT sector, have been very concerned about the sort of rising digital protectionism, data mercantilism, whatever you want to call it, for some time. And it's kind of blending my experience from my time at USTR, when a lot of it was about, in 2008, 2009, there was a lot of talk about, for instance, indigenous innovation in China and local content rules for hardware. The rationale has shifted, and you mentioned this in your talk, to some extent to security and privacy justifications for what seem to often be unjustified barriers to cross-border data flows and other forms of digital commerce. So, we're very glad to be part of this conversation. We are working on a number of those issues that you listed as recommendations directly, and I think it's really important to work with our colleagues in the U.S. government and the European Union and other countries around the world to come up with sort of an international framework that will reduce the instances of unnecessary restrictions on data flows and related issues, and come up with some better common understandings, including these concepts of risk and other things. I also want to mention, and you mentioned it to some extent in the kind of context of the Geneva Convention on Data Issues, but in addition to asking the U.S. government to work directly with our trading partners through trade agreements and multilateral fora, we're also quite engaged in working with them domestically to show leadership in this space so that we have the right kind of legal framework that cuts the right balance between these issues related to privacy and security, law enforcement access, what are the proper procedures. You mentioned this in the Microsoft Irish case, and there are other examples. We're very supportive of increasing the effectiveness, for instance, of the MLAs, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaties, to take some of the pressure off of countries arguing that we need the data residing within our jurisdiction for legitimate law enforcement. Because that's, I think, one of the real challenges we're facing is that, to some extent, the arguments that are being used to justify these things, even if at the end of the day they look and smell a lot like good old protectionism, they're couched in some fairly legitimate sounding policy concerns that we need to figure out how to deal with responsibly.
Jonathan, before I come to you about sort of where we stand on some of the negotiations that you at USTR engaged in, Andre, I want to ask you this question. First of all, any comments you have on the report, or would love to hear that, but also a specific question. How much, I mean, one of the companies also we looked at was Volkswagen, for example, and so you have a lot of very powerful, strong global champions in Europe that I mean, people sort of forget that when they think about Europe. Europe doesn't have, maybe a Google or a Microsoft or a Facebook, but they have great companies in a lot of sectors with big global reach. How much do you think kind of European officials overall are aware of this important sort of resource for European companies that do business across border in traditional industries? In other words, how much are they aware that Volkswagen is a data company now, really?
Is this working? Yeah. Well, officially I had to respond, of course, we're perfectly all aware of what's happening. I think that there isn't yet, across the EU institution and also in governments, in member state governments, perhaps there is some work to do on the level of understanding of how much flow data impacts the traditional industry. In this sense, I personally welcome this report. Of course, the debate on data flows has been ongoing for some time, but this is the first time that I see a report which specifically focuses on other industries. This is an important component of the puzzle. Having said that, I wouldn't say that we are unaware, or that governments in Europe are unaware of the importance of ICT and other flows for traditional industries. And this is reflected in fact, and as Joseph Paladev has mentioned, I think it's important that we keep in mind that data flows are not necessarily and totally flows of personal data, as we call them. In fact, the vast majority of data flows, I would say, have nothing to do with personal data. Even though you might argue that the definition of personal data might be more or less expansive and cover flows that normally you wouldn't consider as personal data. But it's important to keep in mind because, to me, the debate has been a little bit skewed in the sense that, if I may use the word, I'm formally a diplomat, but I'm not very diplomatic, and I apologize for that. There has been a bit of obsession here in the US about the policies and the legal measures that we have in Europe, forgetting that, as I said, if data is not personal data, then data can flow within Europe, outside of Europe, without any problem. We basically don't care. There is no law that says that non-personal data cannot flow outside of Europe. And even when it comes to personal data, and understand it is true indeed that you may agree or disagree with that, but it is true that the concept of personal data, of private identifiable information in Europe is more, its scope is larger than you would find in other parts of the world. That is absolutely true. But even there, our rules are very clear. Cross-border transfer of data outside of Europe is absolutely possible, provided that you respect a certain number of conditions, among which, I mean, I'm not going to list all the conditions, but this is important to keep in mind. If you have the agreement of the data subject, whether because of a contractual arrangement or because that transfer of data is necessary to perform a contract that the data subject has requested to perform, then the transfer can take place. So to take your example, Rob, if people people subscribe to your events, I mean maybe there are people from Europe who have got in my family, probably cannot, but there are people subscribing to your website to follow the event. they are asking you to perform a service for them. And to the extent that that means that they're transferring their personal data to the US, that is fine because they have agreed to transfer personal data. I think it's important to keep that in mind because, again, it's, I'm sure that certain parts of US industry and other industries as well, by the way, would like to see an easier transfer of personal data. But my sense is that sometimes the discussion that we're having here, and in this sense I think that your report, and in particular the recommendation that you give of having more specific data, sorry for the term, but to have more specific data on what you call barriers to trade or data barriers to trade, that is very important because the conversation so far has been, according to me, based more on fears than on facts. I keep on hearing, not in your report, and I'm thankful that Europe does not appear too often in your report. There are other
Except in the good examples.
Yeah, but the point is that if you actually look at what is happening in Europe and what is the law in Europe, I personally cannot see these resistances or these problems with the transfer of data. Now, it might be made better, perhaps it's not entirely what the US or US industry would want, or even our own industries would want. But having said that, I think that our own framework, even if you consider the transfer of personal data, and again, let me reiterate that most of the data flow that we're talking about are not about personal data. The example that you gave, probably, for the case studies that you cover in the study, I think that ING, the bank, there is a clear link with financial and personal data, and probably with the airline, to the extent that there is a link that gave the example of Boeing. But most of the other examples that I saw with Rio Tinto and the others, I don't see where personal data would enter into that equation. And even if there is personal data involved, I can't, let me put it another way. It is not impossible to transfer data outside of Europe, provided that you respect certain conditions. And one last point that I would like to make on the report in general, but it has also been mentioned by a colleague before me. Again, it's important that this conversation is based on facts. The European Union is one of the key founders of the open trade system. So any accusation or thought that Europe is protectionist flies in the face of the fact, because together with the US, Europe is one of the drivers of open trade across the world, whether in the digital sector or in other sectors. Having said that, perceptions have a role to play, and politics has a role to play, and when you have, and I don't want to enter into the debate about the border relations and who does intelligence work, everybody does intelligence work. And I don't think that the mythos and the system, I'm speaking personally here, but I don't think that the mythos and the system that are used in the US are that different from the mythos of the system that are used elsewhere in the world, whether in Europe or in other parts of the world. But having said that, we are faced with a popular reaction, I would say, in Europe. You had, not long ago, you had thousands of people in the streets in Germany protesting against measures being taken in the US. I'm not taking a position on what those people were protesting about, but there were thousands of people protesting in the street for a topic that until not long ago was so abstract and so far away from the lives of people that it was striking, for me at least, to see so many people engage in this sort of political action. So that reality exists. And in this sense, I would say that we are having discussion with the US government in the context of TTIP. We have discussion in the context of visa, the agreement on services that is being debated in Geneva. We have discussion at many other levels. But having said that, when you see, in the case, for example, Microsoft versus the US government, the Microsoft Ireland case, this is the US government, with all due respect, this is the prerogative of the US government to take a position in the judicial case. But when you see the US government claiming that, of course, they should have the right to access any information, any data, anywhere in the world for whatever purpose, because it is in their national interest, fine, that is a position that I can understand. But then you should expect a certain resistance from other parts of the world, which may then turn into arguments that can become, even inadvertently, can become protectionist. Those of us who believe that protectionism is not the solution, that the vast majority of people in Europe, my view at least, would like to avoid that positions taken by other governments, perhaps too extreme positions, too harsh positions, can be used in the hands of protectionist elements of industry and protectionist elements of governments which exist.
Okay. Well, first of all, we fully agree with that last statement, which is why we publicly oppose what the U.S. government is doing in the space, because it does embolden protectionist responses. Secondly, I want to just point out, and by the way, if anybody has a quick response to Andrea, we can do that before I go to Jonathan. I just want to point out, there are really two sources of sort of barriers or limitations to cross-border data. But one of them is protectionism, and on there I agree fully that that's not what Europe is doing. You don't have what Nigeria does or Vietnam or these, which is just purely about the economics of keeping data in your country because you want a server farm or you want to. So fully agree with that, and maybe we can have a little bit of a conversation about how Europe and the U.S. can move an agenda around free trade of global data more robustly, and recognizing that there are legitimate privacy questions that have to be addressed with that. Any response to Andrea before we go to Jonathan? Okay.
Just to quickly perhaps add some facts to the equation as you were requesting. One of the problems we have is the challenges of big data. So in the context of big data, often your use of the data may not emerge until you actually work somewhat with the data. In the current consent models, it is difficult to have anything that is specific enough to use in a big data context. So we're going to have to revisit some of the consent concepts, not to throw them out, but to understand how we apply them to some of the new technologies and their applications. Similarly, there are conversations going on related to the draft regulation at the moment, which seem to shrink the concept of legitimate interest, which is one of the important derogations that is contained within the directive at the moment. We also see the requirements of consent getting more specific and more detailed. So again, these are things that come up also in the draft regulation is the concept of a lawful access request from the U.S. will only be entertained if it's pursuant to a treaty, which makes it very difficult for American companies to operate because you always have to be able to deal with lawful access requests in the countries you come from. So those are some of the hurdles. I would say some of the places where, and these are all based on privacy issues that have been age-old issues, and they're not new, and this isn't something that came up because of Snowden. This is something that's been in the works for a long time, and it's an ongoing discussion, and there's nothing wrong with that discussion. It's an evolving topic. I think the things that came up post-Snowden, which were troubling, were the concepts of an EU cloud, which thankfully the Commission pushed back on and said, no, we're not looking at a pure EU cloud. But we still hear in Germany kind of percolations of, well, we're going to route all of our German information only in Germany, and some of these other kind of exclusionary rules. And those, while they may have a security nexus, also have a trade nexus. And those can't be ignored. And they're not happening at the level of the Commission, they're happening at the level of some of the member states. But that is also troubling.
Okay, so we can come back to some of those points a little later. Jonathan.
First of all, thank you very much for pulling this report together. It does respond to what I think is a real need in, at least in my world, in speaking to trade negotiators on why we should care about data. I think, as Joe points out, there's the big, obvious stuff, and there's all the little transactions we don't necessarily focus on that do drive activity. What I've been trying to do is try to conceptualize data. What the important thing about the report is how information is embedded in so many different types of activity. The history of how we've tried to pull this into trade rules goes back to very specific industries. I think what we're doing now is we're expanding it because it just gets integrated into almost any activity. Started out in financial services. That's obvious. They have to move data around. They are global. The money is essentially been digital for 100 years, and so they needed a rule, and that was one of the first rules that we came up with, that if you're a financial institution or financial service supplier, you get to move your data. Obviously, the telecom guys wouldn't have a network like you're moving data. That's obvious. What we've done in the new trade agreements is trying to expand it to attach to almost any service supplier. Any service supplier, if they're having a right under a trade agreement, they should have a right to data, taking into account all these sensitivities we're talking about. The one piece that people I never focused on was sort of the manufacturing and the non-service, non-financial services sector. And I think the example of Rio Tinto is outstanding because, a Australian company, they were one of the early skeptics when we were trying to put this forward, this concept forward. Why would we care about this in Australia? We don't really have a big IT champion ourselves. We don't want to necessarily agree to rule just for the sake of a big U.S. IT company. So So what it turns out is it's the users that are integrating this into their operations. Manufacturers typically are not covered under the WTO. They're covered under investment agreements. They're covered under comprehensive FTAs. So this is a new area for us to try and look at attaching data flow rights to, which we've done. The right attaches to a covered investor, we call it. So it could be a manufacturer, could be a service supplier, could be a natural person, like a lawyer or something. I think what's interesting is we need to bring the data flow or the data relevance into all these other forms of economic activity. It sort of is, to some extent, like money. I mean, you can't have trade unless you move money. It's not a service in itself, but it's an input that has to have some status within the trade agreement for it to be meaningful for companies to actually be able to take advantage of the rights we're establishing. The other interesting thing that I think has come up, and there's been a lot of talk about many of these services not having anything to do with personal information, and I think increasingly manufacturers are embedding interaction with the consumer into their products. So a car of the future, I'm sure, is going to have some interaction between the consumer and the manufacturer. I just bought a device the other day. I'll pull it up, and people are familiar with it. I can figure out my...
Forgot your password.
Yeah.
Anybody know Jonathan's password?
Somebody probably does. I love this device. So this is, for those who are familiar with it, I bought a device to do my, to deal with my heating system.
Oh yeah, that's your Nest, yeah.
My wife would be happy, but I could turn it on the heat right now. So they sent me a product. But obviously, the value of this product is my ability to interact with it and presumably with the company as well. So whether it's a car, whether it's a jet engine, whether it's this little device, the manufacturers are building interactivity into the product. And all of a sudden, you are going to have this whole issue of, okay, what's the status of the data flows? Are there personal information issues that are relevant? And so we do need to figure out rules, because a lot of these are traded products, to make sure that we don't have barriers that lead to the ability of the companies to offer. So obviously no easy solution to a lot of this. My goal is to try and expand the scope of where we think data issues need to be looked at, and I think your reports on that great.
Well, thank you. I want to drill down a little bit on using that Nest example, because there are people out there who argue Nest is collecting all this valuable and person identifiable information. I mean, for example, let's just say hypothetically that you kept your house really, really cold or something like that. Maybe you could make some algorithmic inference that you have some disease, or that you're never there, or who knows what. And I guess the question there is, and it goes back to Andrea, your point about sort of opt-in and consent. One level you could argue that Nest is PII. They know that it's Jonathan's house. But at one level, you got to sort of say, what if Nest has an agreement that says, first of all, internally in our company, we never ever look at individual names. We just look at houses, and we do analytics around that. And when we share our analytics to say, for example, that Jonathan's house is more efficient than all of its neighbors, I mean, that's what Nest does, but they don't tell me which of my neighbors. So they just say, as a general rule, you're doing better or worse than your neighbors. I mean, so what if we have a sort of framework where A, companies respect that, and B, they make a commitment not to sort of sell that data out on the open market? Why wouldn't we have the default there be cross-border data flows are fine? Or maybe we do.
So what you're asking is, if there is a contractual relationship between you as a consumer of Nest and Nest, and the contract says that we're not going to use your data, we're not going to divulge your data, we're not going to sell it. Actually, it's even if Nest contract, and I'm aware of Nest, but I've never been using it, I might ask you if it's good or not. It's very interesting. Even if this contract said, you know what, I'm going to take your personal data and I'm going to sell it, and I'm going to make billions out of it, and I'm never going to give you one dime of these billions, as long as you consent to it, that's your problem, because I would say as a consumer you're not being responsible. Okay? You can do it. So maybe I don't understand the question, but the point is that maybe what you're asking is consent always necessary? If there is that the question? So is
Yeah, that's the question. So in the Tesco, I mean, you can't get consent for every single thing, particularly with IoT and all. You just can't get consent for everything.
Okay.
Big contractual things you do where you buy a ticket or you. And then the question is, well, what if the counterparty has made these commitments?
So first of all, again, Rob, allow me to repeat because it's your choice as the moderator, of course. I think it would be good if this conversation on data flows and impact on traditional industries will not turn into a conversation entirely on privacy. For the reason that it's part of the conversation. I completely agree that, of course, in today's market, personal identifiable information has become a marketable commodity, so we have to consider that. But the whole discussion is broader than that. Having said that, consent is only one of the legitimate grounds on the basis of which personal data can be processed. This is important to keep in mind because people have this strange idea that either you give consent or you can't handle your data. No, it's not. There are other legal bases, sorry for the pun, there are other legal bases on the basis of which you can process data. On the example that you give, for example, the Tesco example, what happens normally is that when you get one of these discount cards or something, you sign a contract. With the contract, Tesco or another company will say, we're going to use your data for the following purposes, and they're not going to ask you each and every time that you're processing personal data. That's not happening today in Europe, and the system is working. So I'm not worried, to be honest, that we're going to have major problems there. What is important, and this is where we have to be realistic about it, there is a significant difference between the US and the European system, is the so-called purpose limitation principle in Europe. So in Europe, if I sign and I say, I authorize you, company XYZ, to use my data for these purposes, which can be a list of 25 purposes or 50 purposes for the next 10 years, it depends on what you do in the contract. And then that company decides on a whim, you know what, we're going to use that data also for other purposes which were not included in the contract, then that is not admissible. And to be very honest, that is not going to change anytime soon. And I think it's a matter of respect. If privacy, if your personal data is a fundamental right in Europe, but I think it's fair that if then the use of that data changes, I should be informed and should give consent. Now, there is the issue of big data that Joe has raised. Sometimes with big data, you don't know in advance what the use of big data could be. I'm not going to lie to you. That's a debate that we're having in Europe as well. Technological advance always pushes the envelope, pushes the limits of what we have in the law. I don't think, however, that what we have now on the table is because of that to simply say, okay, anything goes. I know that there is a debate also in the US, linked also to the data breaches and to the fact that, let me backtrack on that because perhaps we have to take a step back. I think the point is, whether it's private data, whether it's non-private data, I think we do not realize, people in this room, in this panel, people that deal with these issues every single day, I don't think that, me, myself included, I don't think realize how little people understand of what's actually going on here. And I talk to my parents, I talk to my family, and I try to explain to them both the good and the bad sides of these technologies. They're completely unaware. So before we, a way forward is, or part of the way forward is certainly to explain much better than we're doing at the moment what this brave new world of data flow, whether it's private data or not, actually entails, both in a positive and in a negative sense. But again, to come back to your example, there is an agreement of the consumer to use the Tesco when you get the Tesco card or any other card. That agreement says that they might transfer, Tesco might transfer the data to other countries. Fine. There is never, I want to see a legal case in which somebody sued Tesco or anyone else after having signed the contract. I want to see a legal case in which that person won, because I don't think it can exist. The law in Europe is very clear on that point.
Okay. I want to open it up here for any comments or questions. If you have one, just raise your hand and identify yourself. Yes, sir.
Speak about.
Can you identify yourself?
Sure. My name is Ben Hancock. I'm a journalist here inside U.S. Street. I want to direct my question to John. First of all, I just wanted you to elaborate. You talked about how you can structure the right you talked about it being attached to a coverage request or service supplier or manufacturer. Explain a little bit, if you would, how that works and there were a number of lawmakers late last year who raised some fears about Vietnam, specifically Australia, Singapore, TV members seeking exceptions. I think Vietnam is one of the regions where they wanted some kind of moratorium on disputes. Can you give us an update on whether that's been addressed and how so? Thanks.
Lot there. Let me just back up a bit on how we came up with how we ended up structuring the rule. I think most data flow export issues started out with somebody in country trying to move the data out and they move their country, they wanted to process it outside of the country. That was obviously relevant. We're also looking at cloud services where the suppliers outside of the country and consumers interacting with outside of the country, so the data is coming into the country, but there's still a data transfer that's required. I think the trickier one was, well, what about if I just want to invest in a country and I'm not necessarily a completely data focused entity. I'm a factory, I'm a hotel, and somebody that's typically just a normal investor. Shouldn't they also be able to avail themselves of the data flow, right? Is it relevant for those entities? Well, why not? I mean, why wouldn't a factory want to be able to communicate with its headquarters, but with a hotel want to access a global reservation system? So we did want to come up with a rule that even though they were willing to be in countries, so it wasn't a cross-border transaction in the first instance, they wanted to avail themselves of a global network so they could move data cross-border. So that's what we're trying to do in the provision. I'm not going to get into the specifics. These are confidential texts, so I can't really get too much more specific on how that is being fleshed out. In terms of the exceptions, I mean, I think some of the issues that Rob mentioned in the report are things that we have to deal with. So there is a very specific rule in Australia with respect to health. The law says they have to be scored in Australia. Not here, not in these negotiations. That type of very specific law needs to be undone. That's the way they run their system. Maybe they won't go that way in the future, but that is the existing law. So we have to deal with it. So we have to figure out a way to have the trade rules that address an existing restriction that we come with and may not be so bad that we have to confront it. Other countries we're still working through a range of issues and the scope of which we want to take exception.
Great. So let me, go ahead.
Jim Berger.
Hold on, Mike.
Jim Berger from Washington Trade Daily. Just turning this to TTIP for a second. Since the whole thrust of TTIP is to elevate standards, is there a likelihood that the U.S. standards to be elevated to the EU level in the data privacy? Do you think?
Let's hope not. I don't know. We can have a discussion about that. I mean, it's hard. You have your standards, we have our standards, and they're just different.
I was simply asking who that question was.
That is to Jonathan, to start with, and you can respond.
So I guess the question is whether this is a vehicle for negotiating an increase in U.S. standards. Is that the question? Yeah, I mean, we don't. Trade rules operate at a sort of 40,000 foot level, so we're not in the business of telling specific sectors how they get regulated. We're trying to set high-level principles for how data can move, how governments can intervene within certain boundaries. So it would not be normally a vehicle for doing something like that. It's not illegal, but it's outside the whatever.
I assume you Andrea, you would agree with this statement that if the U.S. had the same framework as the EU does for privacy, that this would be an easier problem to handle.
So let me very briefly, and then I also want to answer that question. But yes, the U.S., the European Commission, which has the right under the EU system to make that kind of assessment, has assessed many years ago now that the U.S. framework for privacy, we're talking about privacy law here, is not adequate compared to EU standards. Okay, so it doesn't afford citizens the same level, it wouldn't afford EU citizens the same level of protection that the rules have in Europe. Having said that, as you know very well, we have a system in place, which is the safe harbor arrangements, through which personal data is flowing between the EU and the US. And even though we are having discussion right now on the safe harbor arrangement between Europe and the US, and they're mostly focused on the scope of the so-called national security exemption in the safe harbor agreement, those talks are ongoing. I cannot take a position on that, but I think there is willingness on both sides to reach a mutual understanding, because again, if there are two parts of the world which agree on the benefit of open trade and agree on the benefit of controlling data, whether it's personal data or not, these are Europe and the US. Now, on your specific question, I wouldn't frame it as elevating anybody's standard, because I think that Europe and the US have their own standards, have their own rules, which are the result of history, cultural differences, different choices, and I think it's we have to be very careful, and with all due respect, that on my side, I'm very careful to use that sort of language, because that's exactly the sort of languages that opponents of trade deals in particular use. I would even say scaremongers, to be honest, but that's very undiplomatic, use in order to refuse even the possibility of it. The point of TTIP is that our economies are already so interconnected, European and US economies are already so interconnected, that we see TTIP, we mutually see TTIP as an opportunity to have a discussion on the compatibility of regulatory systems. Okay, that's not about elevating anybody's system, but to make sure that in terms of process, and if possible substance, the regulatory systems work together. However, having said that, and I need to be very clear on this, we have been very clear from the beginning, and we keep on being very clear with our US counterparts, and I think that everybody understands that privacy and personal data are not part of TTIP. We have been extremely clear on that from the beginning, because in the EU system, the protection of privacy and personal data is a fundamental right, and we do not negotiate fundamental rights in trade rules. We have said this from the beginning, as far as I understand, the US side understands that. The free flow of data, exactly for the same reason that was mentioned at the beginning when you and they also reiterated that the free flow of data is much larger than privacy and personal data. That is a discussion that can be had, and as I'm sure everybody is aware, we are having in the context of service negotiations. That all I would say is that from our perspective, from the European perspective, we do not quite understand what the problem is, because we see that these flows of data, since, as I mentioned at the beginning, if data is of a non-private nature, those flows can't take place. There's no rule in Europe that prevents those flows to take place, so we don't quite understand why do we need to embed rules on that particular flow, since those flows are already taking place. I mean, if you do any kind of trade deals are already complicated enough without discussing rules for situations that do not necessitate. So we have been asking, and again, this is a mystery, we have been asking our counterpart, can you please explain to us, and this was the case both in TTIP and in TISA, and again, this is a mystery, we have been asking, can you please explain what is it that you are trying to achieve by having a discussion on non-personal flows of data, because personal data will not be discussed, and we are waiting for a clarification of that. But again, it's not about, I want to be very clear, it's not about elevating anybody's standard. That's not the way in which we are approaching the negotiations.
Anyone want to respond to that particular point? I mean, I think I know the answer to that question, but I'm...
Well, I would take a twofold answer to the question. One is, I think the concern is when you make a statement about data flows, then there's a pushback on the statement, because there's a concern that it impinges the right to develop a privacy regulation related to those data flows. So the nature of the language gets diminished because of the concern related to the privacy right. And the question is how to come up with a language, and that was one of the TPP problems as well, how to come up with a language that finds a way to address both concerns, the need for the data flows, as well as the ability to have strong language in favor of data flows, but that is respectful of privacy. The other thing I would say is, we ran into this when we were looking at the RFID work. So an RFID tag, radio frequency identification tag, so it allows you to identify this at a distance. A radio frequency identification tag on this bottle here is not personally identifiable information. I just made it personally identifiable information because now you can associate it with a person. So the scope of how you can identify something actually has made much more information personally identifiable than it used to be. Even 9 years ago, I was speaking to a group of people from the electrical supply industry. And this was way before anyone had conceived of a nest meter. But people were contemplating managed metering. So all they're doing is they're kind of figuring out how much energy you're using and trying to, at that time it was to try to alert you when energy was cheaper, so you would move your energy usage to when energy was cheaper. But in detailed managed energy metering, if I all of a sudden start finding out that your energy usage in the morning doubles, and I see other patterns, I can start figuring out that you have a house guest. Then depending on how your energy usage changes, I can start figuring out that your house guest may be part of a relationship. And you can start figuring out the term of that. So again, the potential inferences combined with the drop in scope of what is personally identifiable does bring a lot more of that information under the tent that used to be there. The one thing I do want to dispel though is there's a belief that every time you have a sensor on anything, you have to have a decision point on that sensor. And that just isn't the case. Most of the way we interact, a sensor on the street, yes, you're not going to have any way to figure out how to interact with that. But if you think of the smart home, there is going to be a control panel for the smart home. And it is in that control panel that you will put the options of consent and other things so that they are manageable. You cannot manage it on every single air conditioning unit and other piece of your home. You're going to manage it across local area networks. So to Andrea's point, we don't want to overstate the problem of, everything is going to be personal data, everything is directly connected to the internet, everything is a problem. But we do want to realize that the scope of personal data is increasing, not decreasing, because of our powers to associate data with other information that may be personally identifiable. So I think we have to take the broad concept that while we agree with, and as Andrea said, the US government has stated that privacy is not on the table, there are privacy implications to the word data flow as well. And data flow is not just non-PII data flow. It is not going to a privacy regulation, which is why the language has to be respectful of the ability to deal with a privacy regulation. And that drafting is the difficult portion of the equation, I think.
Steve.
Thanks, Rob. Steve Stewart with IBM. First, let me commend you for the report that ITIF has done here. I think it does a great job of showing that cross-border data flows is important not just for US IT companies, but companies across the world in all sectors. So I think that's great. In looking at your examples, they're all large multinational companies, I believe. But you do still tie them to the benefits to the users. Better products, better services, more reliable services, safer products, and that's great. So you start to see some consumer benefit. If you take the view that the benefits are to the users of this, it's not just the IBM, Oracle, Microsoft, Google that were mentioned earlier, I think you can do more contributions in this area, say, to follow-on research. So, for example, if you to look at examples that are small businesses around the world, not just large multinationals, make it a little bit more personal, or better yet, even from a consumer angle, students, individuals, how they use all these different services or products, and then you start thinking, well, what if I couldn't transfer this data? What if that benefit were taken away from me? How would it impact my life? That would make it, I think, a little bit more real. And then when you get to the discussion, Joe was talking about mitigated risk. Everybody knows the risks of data breaches, invade your privacy. They don't think enough about the benefits. So you need something on the other side to balance the equation. And for further research, my suggestion would be to look at this more from a small business angle, from an individual a user angle, whatever role they're in, whether it's student, citizen, consumer, business owner, or whatever.
No, I certainly agree with that, Steve. I mean, I think it's emblematic of the problems with debates today that somehow we assume that anything that's good for GM has got to be bad for consumers, but anything that's good for French or car repair shop has got to be good for everybody. Just sort of nonsensical. Big business bad, small business good. But that's the reality of the world. And if you want to push any policy today, all you have to do is wrap it in the mantle of small business, and you're good to go. All right, leaving my cynicism aside. I 100% agree with you around sort of the end user benefit, which small businesses, last I looked, most of them trying to make a profit. So even there, we don't care about them, nor do we frankly care about big business. What we care about is the end user, the worker, the consumer, the environment. So I 100% agree with you. We have done pieces like that. I encourage anybody here who's not familiar with our Center for Data Innovation that we have, which is datainnovation.org. There's a number of reports that talk about the beneficial uses of data. There's a weekly email that every week there's like the latest benefit. But yes, I agree with you that's something that we need to do. We need to do more. In fact, we are going to actually be doing a report on that. So that'll be coming up. Yes, sir. There's a mic here.
Yes, hello. My name is Adam B. Student with Politico. I had a question about the TPP and this issue of data flows. Is it, I know there are like a number of political issues that will have to be resolved at a higher level. Is this one of those issues, given the issues over, you know, protection of national laws and privacy and exceptions?
Wouldn't characterize it as that. I think we've got a pretty good consensus that embracing a set of rules that addresses these issues is in everybody's interest. There's enough flexibility there that deals with some of the sensitivities, and it's not at this point
So, Jonathan, I want to follow up on a point you made earlier about exceptions. And you know, exceptions sometimes are the giant hole that you could drive the truck through. And you know, oh well, you know, we'd want to have exceptions for health because that's different than other data. And you know, it sounds good. You know, who can be against that? The reality is, it's a completely meaningless exception. It has no effect on anything. I remember a case a decade ago in the U.S. where a California healthcare system was offshored its data to a company, or excuse me, outsourced its data processing to a company that did the data processing in India. And there was a rogue employee in India who put that data up on the web and made money. Now, we all know there are no rogue employees in the U.S., and that would never, ever happen because all our employees are honest. So the point of that little story was either the state or civil parties in that case had legal reciprocity to the U.S. company to file a suit against them, which they could and did do, I believe. So it didn't matter where the data were. What mattered is who had legal responsibility for it. So if a healthcare system in Australia wants to put its data in the cloud in Iceland, it has no difference on security or privacy than if they put it in Brisbane. How much, you know, do you think U.S. government is able to sort of make that case effectively and to any effect?
Well, I think what we want to set out is a framework that allows that conversation. Right? So if a country is asserting that the only way they can address a security or privacy issue is through localization, we want to be able to tell it. We want to be able to walk through all the elements that they're trying to achieve and say, okay, is the conclusion that it has to stay local or not? My bias is to say that no, it shouldn't. It should be. You should be able to have it outside. That's not a foregone conclusion. There may be good arguments that governments have that they can bring forward that says in this case it absolutely has to stay here. But what we want is a system where we can work through those issues, and so that it's not just a knee-jerk reaction that local is better, but you have to justify it. You have to show the evidence and the arguments that make it the only option that you would prevail on. So, and then, you know, someone else will sort out who has a better argument, but we do want, in the first instance, to be able to have that argument. And up to date, in the trade agreement, we haven't really had that. What we've had to rely on is, well, I assumed I could offer a cross-border service, and this obviously prevents it, and therefore it impairs my service. It's sort of a weak argument. And so we want to have the baseline obligation. Fundamental to these services is the data flow. If you want to restrict it, there is a burden of being able to justify it, and you have to be willing to.
So just to clarify on that point, when you say there's a burden, are you thinking that's in the trade agreement and these are locked in either as binary yes, no's, or as one goes forward, let's say some new thing comes up in a country, then could they add something, could they take something off? I mean, obviously you can always take something off. In other words, is there going to be a process in place where these exceptions are adjudicated? Are they all ahead of time or post?
No, we write a general rule, and then when an individual proposal comes up in a country, you would try and evaluate that in connection with the rule. And these are all sovereign governments that participate in these. At the end of the day, if they decide to do something, they will do it and can do it. And this trade agreement is not going to stop it. What it is going to do is provide a basis for having an argument, and ultimately, if a country feels like it's going to dispute, but even dispute settlement is not, you can't force a country to do something they don't want to do. There's a penalty, but you still have to respect the sovereignty of each participant.
Well, in theory, you could bring out the nuclear option, which is you kick them out of a trade agreement, because by definition, I mean, there are a lot of countries, I put China in this category explicitly, or a lot, they enjoy the benefits of having the trade agreement, but they also enjoy the benefits of being able to manipulate it. So these countries are saying they want to be in TPP for a real reason, because they want benefits, and potentially, I'm not saying this, potentially then they want to be able to backslide and get sort of prisoner's dilemma individual benefits. So there is always that point, and I guess not to push you too much on TPP or why wouldn't we have agreements in the future like TPP that have sort of an exit regime in them that says, okay, if once you're in, you're not in for life. You sort of have to be reevaluated every 5 years to see if you're complying, and if you're not, out you go.
Most of these agreements do have review mechanisms. The idea is not to kick people out, but it's to work through the issues and hold people accountable to the promises they made. I've never thought of that. It's an interesting idea, but not something I give thought to before. But just to follow up, I mean, we certainly do, once we set a body of rules forward, we do look at that as a baseline. Is a new entrant going to be welcome into the club? Right? So if we come up with a rule, say, on data flows, and we know that a potential applicant just doesn't believe in that, we're going to look twice at whether they are
Okay, so we have about 5 or 6 minutes left. What I want to do is I just want to ask each of our panelists, maybe starting with Andrea, just a couple of minutes of closing thoughts, and where do you see us going forward on all these issues?
Thank you, Rob, and thanks Ed, for this conversation, which was very helpful to me. I think my closing thought is, in my job, I cannot really give recommendations to the U.S. government. That's not part of my task, but you can. That's your job.
It's just to me, and
I
then
would like to suggest to you.
Then I'll pass it along to Jonathan.
One of the things that I think was missing from your report, which for the rest, as I said, I found it very interesting and very timely. I think this is actually not to the U.S. government, it's more to the U.S. industry. I think that an error, if I can be absolutely blunt, an error that was committed by U.S. industry in the initial discussion on data flows, which, as you know, date back since several months, not at least a couple of years. The first report on these issues came out at least 1 year ago. If the most vocal representatives of your industry are companies that make a living out of the use of private data, then you shouldn't be surprised that the term data flows is automatically associated with private data. And I'm not going to name names, but I think that can be easily seen that the importance of your report, but I think it can be spelled out even more clearly, is that until now, people in Europe most people in Europe would say, are truly convinced that the only one that would benefit from a more liberal data flow regime are companies whose only business model is using or abusing, depending on the point of view, personal data. That is simply not the case, but the reason why that is the perception is that, I never heard U.S. companies outside of the IT sector, within the IT sector, I never heard U.S. companies that are not using personal data in such a huge manner as some companies do. I don't see them at the forefront of these discussions. I don't see them at the table, and this has an impact in terms of perception. And sorry, I don't want to be a bureaucrat here, but if this is a political discussion, and the politics perception is at least half of the conversation. So that is the recommendation I would give. More companies, more U.S. companies have to come forward and explain why to them data flows are important. And I will say the same to European companies. But for the rest, great report, and thank you so much for the conversation.
Great, thank you. No, I think that's an excellent insight. My understanding, although Joe knows more than I do, is that BRT is trying to do more of that, the Business Roundtable. which is a broader range of companies and industries. So, Joe.
Yeah, and I would say we agree with Andrea's concern, and I think IT companies have actually been reaching out to customers and to others to become more vocal on these issues across the board. So I think it was something we noticed as well, and we are trying to rectify the problem. We're also doing that through the International Chamber of Commerce and other places. So it is an effort underway, and it is an effort underway on both sides of the Atlantic, not just for, you know, the connected car is not just going to be from GM, it's going to be from Renault and BMW and everyone else as well. So these issues are not limited to American manufacturing side, and in fact, if you think about what in Germany is called Internet 4.0, that is all about manufacturing platform as a connected concept. And so these are all going to be issues of tremendous importance, and we just need people to perhaps be a little more vocal in the trade space on those issues. So we completely agree with that right on.
Great, thank you. Jonathan.
Keep up the good work. I think this is exactly what we need. I really appreciate it, and look forward to working with you on fleshing out more of these examples and others.
Great. Likewise. Jared.
So I guess for closing, I would like to just kind of touch back a little bit on the discussion we had about exceptions. And the concern that we are having as we watch over the last 12, 18, 24 months of new policies, both related to cross-border data flows, but other kinds of restrictions on digital trade, some of the stuff that Joe mentioned earlier, is that a lot of them are increasingly being used, justified by security rationale. And so I think the stakes are very high in the TPP and the TTIP to get good obligations that have appropriately focused exceptions and limitations language. I think we also need to be looking at the practices existing or proposed of some of these other countries around the world to respond appropriately and effectively to them. And I guess I'll just say I'm thinking of China right now, because if some of the security justified measures that they are proposing in the financial sector and other critical infrastructure sectors are allowed to kind of go through as they appear to be proposed, it would really be sort of a roadmap for a lot of the other countries that are dabbling with these ideas as well. And it has an unraveling effect on the whole sort of economies of scale of this global internet and the potential that this has, not just for our members, but for all of the companies that we've been talking about and that are referred to in your report, big and small.
Yeah, and I guess just to close, to me, that goes back to Andreas' point about why is the both governments, EU and US, trying to incorporate these kinds of things into a TTIP, and my view is it's exactly for that reason, even though that may not be an issue between us now, or even in the future, it's a strong signal to other countries that if you want the gold standard trade agreement, if you want to maximize these things, you have to have that kind of arrangement. And to Jared's point, the new Chinese rules that came out in January are, probably the most troubling that we've seen of any country, any time in this technology space, and send a very, very troubling message about global integration, and we'll see what happens with it. So with that to close, first of all, I was remiss on not thanking and acknowledging the two authors of this report, Alan McQuinn, who's here from ITIF, and Daniel Castro. So they're the real thought leaders behind this space and did the work on the report, so thank you for that. Secondly, thank you for all of you coming and attending today, and then finally, please join me in thanking a great panel this morning.